What if I told you the most successful wuxia-themed MMO wasn't a Chinese-developed game, but instead developed by a South Korean pioneer and MMORPG titan in their own right, NCSoft? If you're connected to the East a little bit, you probably wouldn't be that confused, considering the most popular games in China oftentimes are Korean games, such as Dungeon Fighter Online and more. While wuxia, the Chinese-themed martial arts made famous by films such as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and Hero, where leapless bounding and gliding and kick-ass martial arts are the norm, was quite popular in the film realm, but it struggled in video games, with that bubble only recently being bursted by titles like Black Myth Wukong, a game based on the most famous Chinese story and legend in history. Especially in the virtual world space, with only a few wuxia-themed MMORPGs even being attempted, let alone only even fewer succeeding, as Dungeon Fighter Online as mentioned, Age of Wushu, and the topic of this video, Blade & Soul. Blade & Soul, which originally launched far back in 2012 in South Korea only, was put on the shelf for then about 4 years before being brought to the West for their January 2016 launch on PC and NA and EU. This, alongside a slew of other issues present throughout the game's long life cycle, which is still actually alive, would contribute to it being featured on this series. That's because Blade & Soul wasn't the only game in the series of Blade & Soul. It actually spawned a failed sequel, a failed mobile port, and even a mostly failed mobile spin-off too. This was after blueballing the world with a Unreal Engine 4 port that nearly took them the development time of a full virtual world in its own right to finally come to Blade & Soul, and by the time that it did, most had moved on. By then, Blade & Soul was already 9 years old, and the UE4 port wasn't enough to stoke flames to change much about the future of Blade & Soul, which was only continuing to age. The last-ditch effort we typically see from developers with aging online worlds is an attempt to reignite the classic audience who originally supported their game, combining it oftentimes with a newer and better-looking version of the game, which is what Blade & Soul Neo could be described as in 2025. However, as it stands from the most recently publicly released financials, Blade & Soul has been slowing down now for a while, and the sequel, Blade & Soul 2, is performing even worse amongst new competition. Worse, the majority of the games that are outperforming BNS are older games. This means that something had to have gone wrong, right? Why did Blade & Soul fail at making as much money as some of its stablemates despite having arguably more marketing and coverage? Why did anything not the original game, which has still been limping around, especially in the West for multiple years now, fail so spectacularly? This is a special Death of a Game episode. No, not because we're covering a 10-plus-year-old virtual world with arguably some of the best combat we have seen in the space, but because we will also be covering the very short-lived sequel, Blade & Soul 2, and the accompanying mobile games Blade & Soul Mobile and Revolution. So it's kind of like a 4-for-1 video. Well, detectives, you know why you're here, and what happens next, but for those that don't, the newly minted detectives if you will, this is the Death of a Game series, a series where we take a timeline of events and utilize it and various clues that unfold from it to diagnose what the largest contributing factors to a death of a game or company, or in this case, to a gradual death shifting to a maintenance mode, and the overall failure as a series IP. Make sure to pay attention to the clues along the way, finally culminating in a final deduction, every detective's moment to act as arrogantly as possible, or just solve the case in their own way. And stay tuned to the very end of the episode for a hint on what the next case will be about. There's a lot of clues to juggle in this episode, so let's take a journey to the east for a bout in the wuxia-themed world where martial arts and martial might ruled above all. The story of Blade & Soul begins with its herald, NCSoft, who would quietly enter into an exclusive deal with Sony regarding publishing some MMORPGs on the PlayStation and Xbox. And don't ask me why for the Xbox as well, just reporting what was happening. Now fast forward a bit, and this deal would actually not end up in either a Blade & Soul or Guild Wars 2, which were both reportedly originally planned for console, to launch on console. More interestingly, NCSoft would never actually launch an MMORPG on console, which would lead to many other Korean companies not having competition there, such as Bluehole with Terra Online, who you will hear about more soon, and Pearl Abyss with Black Desert Online, filling that void on consoles quite successfully. NCSoft would technically announce their upcoming wuxia-themed MMORPG for the first time at a college event in Korea. Men loving virtual worlds and living in Korea seems so casual. This team would go on and form Bluehole, which would make Terra Online, a revolutionary combat-defining MMORPG in its own right. The drama and relevancy is that NCSoft lost this opportunity, and even more, and then threatened litigation over it. While Terra and Blade & Soul are different games and have pretty different focuses, also feature different worlds and different backgrounds, both games are often compared to each other because of their comparisons to fighting and action games, being used as like the golden standard in the virtual world space when it comes to combat systems. So the origin story being so closely tied together with these two titles is very interesting. And some have their favorites, as they'll probably tell me in the comments below. But although Blade & Soul might have gotten more attempts, Terra seemed to stick more with players ultimately, as we will talk more about at the end of the video. Blade & Soul, as the game would be known as, would be set to launch in Korea originally as early as 2008, but it wouldn't launch, and let alone have a playable beta for another multiple years. After multiple delays, which is never a good sign for an early budding MMORPG, but honestly kind of normal for the space, the closed beta in Korea would finally be playable in April of 2011, and have their second test in August of 2011. During this time, Tencent, positioning themselves for takeover with their leverage in the Chinese market, as a Chinese video game publishing titan themselves, would achieve the rights for Blade & Soul in China. I honestly think, however, this was a bit of finessing by NCSoft to leverage their expertise with the fact that they were making a wuxia-themed virtual world by chance. Because there weren't any guarantees, wuxia or not, China would respond well to Blade & Soul. Though considering Dungeon Fighter Online's popularity as a kung fu fighting online game in China, it wasn't really that much of a gamble. Open beta would hit June of 2012, and impressively the population would jump up to a whopping 150,000 players. The popularity in Korea alone was impressive, but the rest of the world, myself included, who got the chance to play it or watch others playtest the game in Korea, also wanted a piece of the pie. For starters, Blade & Soul was just looking absolutely gorgeous. In 2012 and would immediately reach multiple hundreds of thousands of players. However, as was common for the time, Korean MMOs that found success were starting to find themselves slowly coming to the West, as in years' time, or not at all. My speculation is that's because due to the majority of NCSoft's revenue coming to the East. Here's some free analysis. For example, Korea alone accounts for 63% of NCSoft's revenue, with another whopping 24% coming from Asia abroad. That means that due to royalties making up the other half of the last 6.4%, the entire NA and EU only make up 6.4% of NCSoft's revenue. So global launches weren't really in vogue, even with Ion, which would hit major success back in 2008. That alone wasn't enough to warrant more of that years later, though. So global launches still weren't the norm, and arguably still aren't the norm in Korea, and even Japan. Money-making decisions about local markets or not, that made sense. These decisions just created resentment with the global market, and a lag on expectations and what would be successful in Korea and then abroad. Because in the case of Blade & Soul and many other Korean titles, it would take not just 3 years for the title to become playable in the West. Even when it did become playable, it was just gonna slowly trickle out the old content from Korea. Blade & Soul would soft launch in China November 23rd, 2013, and frankly speaking, this made a lot of sense, as I mentioned before. I mean, it's a wuxia-themed game after all, right? However, as I stated also when I mentioned Tencent, there weren't any guarantees that it was going to take off in China, especially when Blade & Soul is wuxia-themed, but I mean, look at the logos, the box art, and the avatars. They're pretty damn anime. 2 years after launching in Korea, and Blade & Soul would launch in Japan as well, preparing for a Western launch in the following years. Not only had Blade & Soul in Asia quietly become one of the biggest esports, and arguably one of the most popular MMORPG esports ever, they also dropped an anime around the same time to coincide with the Japanese launch. And while it's not better than Ragnarok Online's anime in my opinion, which to be fair also was a manhwa previously, it's not bad at a 3.7 out of 5 on Crunchyroll, being the standard hero fight through the bunch of scenarios thrown at you kind of anime, I guess. But popularity for Blade & Soul was peaking in 2014, and I remember watching some of these tournaments myself about the esport, eagerly awaiting my chance to play the game too, like I'm sure many watching the video now did as well. And boy, was the game impressive. While Terra's combat was almost always centered around boss fights or BAMs, the big-ass monsters, Blade & Soul seemed to take more of a different approach and was more tailor-made to the 1 versus 1 PvP combat. When played with the top players in Korea, the combat suddenly would evolve into a symphony of action sequences, combos, and wuxia magic. From watching this footage, you almost forget this is an MMORPG due to how much of a fighting game it plays like and how fast it is with the dodge sequences and combo chains. While Blade & Soul as an esport might have seemed strange at first glance, its massive popularity in Asia perfectly fit into the 1 versus 1 focus meta and style of combat that fighting games were already famous for. I also think it looks a bit more intuitive than World of Warcraft's esport, just from a strict noob watching it for the first time perspective, since it utilizes more real fighting styles and fighting attacks, though the game did have a pretty high skill cap. Blade & Soul would finally be playable in beta form in the West 3 years after its initial launch in Korea, October 2015. This will be prepping the Western audience, finally, for the upcoming launch set in January of 2016. Though I have to keep reminding people, Terra came out in 2012 in the West, so expectations for Blade & Soul were noticeably and understandably higher. A slew of online titles, WildStar included, had already came out, and the bar was already being raised before Blade & Soul ever even launched. Blade & Soul would finally launch January 19th, 2016, a whopping 4 years after it was initially launched in Korea, which although I have mentioned a few times and you feel like I'm definitely beating a dead horse, even just a little bit, MMORPGs already take ages to launch and oftentimes when they do are outdated in many fashions. When you add another 4 years on top of that, you have a game that was made with an engine that was already completely outdated, with Unreal Engine 4 having launched in 2014. I mean, by the time that it launched in the western half of the world, it was already technically 9 years old. But I think that the critical reception of the game kind of reflects this, where Blade & Soul would struggle to score even a 70 out of 100 on aggregate review website Metacritic. GameSpot, who scored it a 6 out of 10, would love the action-heavy combat with the beautiful environments and decent story present, as well as the kick-ass PvP arena system, while lamenting the boring, repetitive questing, lack of content from the OG version, and the short and boring dungeons. Managing to wow outlets with your combat and graphics as a late-to-the-scene virtual world is super impressive, but worse, people were wondering, where was all the content? I mean, the game originally launched in 2012, and the 2016 version was supposedly lacking some of the original post-launch content. The middling reception might have seemed salvageable, but remember, the clock was already ticking. Unreal Engine 4 was already out, and the next generation of online games were already starting to come out. Well, sort of. Even if Blade & Soul managed to maintain a consistent content schedule, they might struggle to soar above moderate success, especially with faster and heavier monetization on it than Terra Online had. The community who believed in Blade & Soul was aware of this, and was trying to warn NCSoft that they needed to tone things down and not increase the monetization any further. There were complaints about the scummy currency practices, where you would have to buy the next tier of currency to afford the previous freemium subscription. But wait, there's more. Someone even did the math, as they always do with virtual worlds, and that's why I love nerds, let's be honest. It would take 214 pouches to fully unlock your bank and inventory, which would then cost around $93 USD, which would be per character. Another $10 for the talent spec tabs, and another $15 for just an average costume, and then you being restricted to just 2 character slots. That means to pay and play for a year, you were spending hundreds of dollars theoretically, and the value just wasn't adding up. Blade & Soul, however, warts and all, would update their game rather consistently. Of course, with the benefit of most of that content coming from Korea already, with a new class, the Soul Fighter, and 2 new zones in 2016. They would also add the heroic dungeon Heaven's Mandate as well. But again, these were just updates slowly trickling from what already came out in Korea. Even worse than what ArcAge had as a trickle, taking years more. Blade & Soul Esports would attempt to make headway in the West, February 2017, with a North American Championship, But as a watcher of the original Korean boom, the magic just wasn't there in the same way anymore. First off, the level of play was obviously lower, since the Easterners had a lot more time to play the game, but second, it just didn't nearly look as cool years later. But new content would also come in 2017, including the Skybreak Spire and Temple of Illuvium raids, as well as a new Gunslinger class and all new ranged DPS class. I don't particularly like this class inclusion, not just because it doesn't feel super wuxia, because it's just another ranged DPS, which the game already had like 5 of them. And I generally like the Gunslinger as an archetype type of approach. Strictly doing a healer or support archetype doesn't really work in Blade & Soul because most of the game is 1v1. In a slightly surprising bit of news, Blade & Soul, or their caretakers at least, NCSoft in their in-house studio, would announce not just a sequel for Blade & Soul already, Blade & Soul 2, but both a mobile adaptation for the original game and a mobile spin-off with chibi characters. This was on top of the by-the-numbers Netmarble mobile game that seems to always find its way into my series, Blade & Soul Revolution, in development at the time, which was complete with the infamous endurance system that make mobile gaming a chore and utterly boring and derivative auto-combat systems that allow you to brain AFK to the win. Little details were revealed about the sequel, but the mobile adaptation already kind of had a path forward, with Lineage already having a massively successful mobile adaptation. A pioneer in the virtual world space, especially in Korea, and NCSoft's biggest moneymaker even still. Frankly speaking, mobile adaptations were sort of safer for NCSoft, who although they made tons of money from other games besides Lineage, within the Lineage umbrella, the sequel didn't really make that much money either with Lineage. Sequels were just kind of risky, but Korea figured out a way to do it while still surfacing the old audience at the same time. Just keep updating both games, and if the new one doesn't take off, slowly put it onto the shelf while managing a mobile game that refreshes or reboots the first game. Unreal Engine 4, which had now been out in the market for 4 years, would start becoming a persistent idea in the heads of Team Bloodlust, the in-house development team at NCSoft, working on Blade & Soul in the summer of 2018. And I totally see their angle. UE3 was unruly to work with in online virtual worlds and was showing their age. Terra also utilized it, so in a fell swoop, they were like defeating 2 of their biggest issues with the game. The performance in the UE3 engine, and the fact that they were kind of one-upping Terra, their competition. Blade & Soul shifting to UE4 could give the game some new life, but what if that gamble didn't pay off? Because it was a gamble. That would mean that Team Bloodlust just spent all of their time and resources on something that didn't really add any new content and could do little to bring back old school players. This number was rumored to be, according to my Korean sources, in the 100,000 range plus. So this shift was set to be expensive and time intensive, but I feel if Blade & Soul 2 could pick up the slack, this multi-pronged attack could potentially be very successful, like it was proved with Lineage. I think this gamble makes even more sense when you consider that Korean developers were likely aware that Westerners would be okay with such changes, or were, in the past, okay with such changes, while slowly just getting trickled the old Korean content still. But that was beginning to fade more and more, especially as Westerners became more aware of the Korean-style games like this, with the player base being more wise as to when they're being fed the same content that already came out years before, starting as far back with Ion, and even progressing to ArcAge too. The Western audience, and understandably so, was getting tired of the year-old updates and games being sold to them like it was something new, and the fact that it felt like their wants and desires weren't as important as the local audience back home. I think Blade & Soul is another culmination of that, where it had larger player drops and less overall players compared to its competitor Terra for most of its lifetime, probably aided by the fact that Terra was on console, but also aided by the fact that Terra got a lot more current updates than Blade & Soul did. Blade & Soul Revolution would launch in Korea December 2019 and eventually come to the West the following year. Revolution was not really much to reflect on. I'm just mentioning it because it's a Blade & Soul game, as it's the typical auto-combat mobile slop game, simply bearing the Blade & Soul name. Which sucked because Blade & Soul, unlike many other Asian virtual worlds, actually had a compelling story. It's a story of ancient power, mystery, vengeance, and even revenge. One that looks absolutely bleak at times, while still managing to accomplish that hero's journey that China and Chinese stories are famous for. It's also much better translated and localized than Solo, or Swords of Legends Online, which would come out later in 2021. Though I must say, Solo was much better looking, and true to wuxia themes in many ways, so go watch my Death of a Game on that game too to find out why it failed. In 2020, major news would hit the web concerning Blade & Soul and its multiple projects. For starters, the mobile adaptation that was supposed to come out would be outright cancelled, and the chibi game as well. These teams would then be merged into the Blade & Soul 2 team, which was not the same team that was working on the original Blade & Soul. While this might seem like a strength, focusing more on the pressing sequel, the issue is that canceling your mobile adaptation shows that, in some ways, that your original game that you were adapting it from wasn't doing well enough to warrant that. Whether they didn't have enough belief in what they created and their product, or just the chance that it could make the same money that Lineage M was making, is a mystery. We just know it was cancelled, and then they were putting all of their eggs in the UE4 update and the sequel basket now. Blade & Soul 2 would launch 2021, a few years after its initial announcement, on PC and mobile devices. While the sequel features cool stuff like crossplay across platforms, the combat is basic point-click gameplay. Wah wah wah. My guess is this change was to accommodate the mobile devices, but then I guess my question's why? It feels like they then put all their eggs into a whole new basket altogether, though it vaguely looked like Blade & Soul. Worse, Blade & Soul 2, just like Revolution, would have auto gameplay, which would make you feel like you spent more time watching the game, including the cutscenes, than playing it. It reminds me of when Dark Eden got a sequel that basically had none of the original core parts that people loved about it. Blade & Soul 2 was a colossal failure for NCSoft, also demonstrating a cartoonish level of misunderstanding of what made the fast-paced action combat game the first time around good. The much-teased and hyped UE4 update would finally hit alongside the dual blade class, which I actually think is a pretty freaking awesome class. They should do a triple blade. Anyway, the UE4 update was not at all it was cracked up to be, sadly. Well, sort of. I don't know if they went back and changed the text or the summaries of it, but technically speaking, NCSoft only ever promised a visual engine update, and that's kind of what we got with the UE4 update in September of 2021. It was a glorified graphical update, and not even a good one, because it didn't rebuild anything in the world seemingly, and just kind of played it at a higher fidelity. Texture repacks made by community members and many RPGs are more involved in this, and yet this was a major cost and development focus for Blade & Soul, as well as the sequel, and both were proving to be pretty colossal failures. While the UE4 update did bring some better performance to it, it also removed the controller support for Blade & Soul, and no new server was created alongside the update, meaning that even if new players or old players wanted to return, they were kind of now out of their league, with a game even more rife with pay to win. It's been a while since I said it's pay to win in an MMORPG video, especially a Korean one. Not really. But Blade & Soul was a free-to-play game, and thus had not just freemium services, but a cash shop that not only sold cosmetics in the way of costumes, but straight-up loot boxes and gacha mechanics, such as skill books, weapon core slots, or even soul badges, which all were obtainable through gacha. You could then sell certain items from the cash shop for gold and use that gold to then buy basically anything from the auction house. Which is why the UE4 update wasn't particularly useful for new players, because the economy was already screwed, when they were competing against players with an unlimited power ceiling, and in some cases an unlimited pocketbook, and a 5-year advantage. While Western games these days are fairly pay-to-win as well, making nearly all virtual worlds pay-to-win these days, Eastern games usually allow you to endlessly expand your character in a way that you can't really in Western virtual worlds, making them a lot more power-hungry or vertical feeling, which in a PvP-centric game like Blade & Soul wasn't a good thing. It's also something that Black Desert Online would mimic to a great degree. Content would slow down for Blade & Soul finally in 2022 through 2024. With the game only receiving one major heroic dungeon during this time and nearly no major updates. This would signify a shifting in my eyes to a maintenance mode, where the goal is to keep the game afloat for as long as possible, while milking the game with the least amount of effort possible. While this is a good way to keep the game alive at the very least, it results oftentimes in no new content, and what came next would sort of confirm that for me. That was Blade & Soul Neo. Originally unveiled in the fall of 2024 in Korea first, Neo would take a number of months but then be brought to the West, February 2025, introducing the UE4 update with a classic progression server style approach. It was kind of a neat idea, if the server wasn't chock full of even more microtransactions than before. And even past that, for those that were just numb to that at this point, Blade & Soul Neo, according to Massively OP, wasn't even really that different from the original Blade & Soul either. The bet was, though, like classic WoW, maybe eventually Neo could sprout to evolve to something past the current content schedule and release new content in a more modern context. But remember, Blade & Soul, engine update or not, was already 13 years old at this point, and UE4 was like 11 years old itself, with UE5 coming out in April of 2022. The magic of games like Blade & Soul and many Korean games are the fact that they were ahead of their time, visually and gameplay-wise. When that starts to quickly fade away, there's not much reason to come back to those games, especially when, Neo server or not, the end goal will kind of always end up being the same thing. A stat-bloated game where you can hit characters for millions of damage and can basically do solo raids. That's because the sheer amount of ways to gain power in the game through spending money are just too high. These levers not being removed show that milking the players before they leave versus hoping that they stay for long term was more of the focus, as usual with such a progression-style server. We even saw this with ArcAge after getting bought out by Gamigo. They might have made a classic-themed server, but it failed to really nail the classic feeling of Blade & Soul. It was no WoW Classic server. And remember, Blade & Soul was late to the West anyway, yet it still managed to, late or not, feel present and relevant. But the essence of what made Blade & Soul wasn't there anymore 10 years plus later. And with a massively failed sequel to boot, it didn't seem like the franchise was going to have any more major steps forward. NCSoft would still bring Blade & Soul 2 to China, announced March 2025, showcasing that, in my opinion, they weren't very serious about the franchise anymore. Because if the first game didn't work there, why would the second, deemed lesser game, work either? Before we transition to the final deduction detectives, there's something we have to also tackle that we've been talking about since the beginning of the video. That's the fate of Terra Online, and how it's almost inexplicably linked to Blade & Soul. Now bear with me, sure, Terra being a spin-off NCSoft project doesn't qualify for that alone, but also due to the fact that both games focused on visuals and gameplay, something that wasn't very common in the virtual world space. Opinions aside though, past a point, Terra was just simply speaking more successful. Sure, it perished online maybe faster in the West, but it had more successful console servers that Blade & Soul never got, despite being built for it originally. On top of this, Terra managed to make more of a unique identity and resist some of the microtransactions overload early on. It also came to the West faster, where by the time that Blade & Soul came to the West, it was a lot more outdated. Now in the end, both games actually have a shockingly similar history, starting as difficult combat-focused games with nice graphics and ending up being games that look a bit dated and are way too easy these days. But I think it's safe to say that due to the overall players reached and overall global permeation, not just in Korea, that Terra was the more successful of the combat-focused Korean MMOs, even amongst games like Vindictus. It was reportedly played by nearly 30 million players globally. But it's not really a competition anymore, with both games past their primes. But one thing's for sure, Blade & Soul has shaped the current future MMO space to come with its unique blend of fighting game elements and tab-target MMORPG combat. With that music playing, we have reached the end of this lengthy, twisty, and turny case, detectives, and it's time to list the largest contributing factors to the game's eventual death. Though more so everything else surrounding what a shell Blade & Soul has become today, with the game itself still kind of hobbling on. And so, in case you missed it, why do you think Blade & Soul failed as a franchise? It took nearly 4 years to come to the West. It had very stiff competition. Stat bloat. It had pay-to-win gacha, mechanics, and loot boxes. It ultimately just trickled the Korean content for the Western audience. Blade & Soul was milked with a crappy mobile game and a sequel that didn't even resemble the first game. It had a lackluster UE4 engine upgrade that they kind of bet all their cards on. Now, something quite ironic about all of this is that in the end, NCSoft attempting to cash in on the massive Chinese audience in Asia abroad, and the US audience with Blade & Soul, with their Chinese wuxia-themed game, all the while MiHoYo, a Chinese developer through Genshin Impact, which is actually more of an anime-themed action game playable on mobile, would make global waves. Perhaps that's a sign that the world still isn't quite ready or conditioned yet enough for a proper wuxia virtual world. But while I am biased as a lifelong martial arts practitioner, I think Blade & Soul is proof that it's mainly due to the execution of things, not due to the themes themselves. Blade & Soul is still playable, though you're never really gonna quite relive that initial experience back in the day, back in those early 2010s, where suddenly virtual worlds had something cutting edge combat-wise for once. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you liked or disliked about Blade and Soul in the comments below and some of your experiences with the game.